Today we welcome back a great friend of the gallery, Helen Park Bigelow, the daughter of the great David Park. As I was just saying to Helen, I'm sure many of you who've gone to see the marvelous Matisse Diebenkorn show at SF MoMA have reflected on what an incredible efflorescence of genius, to use an old-fashioned word, that we witnessed in Berkeley, or witnessed the recreation of in the person of David Park, Richard Diebenkorn, Elmer Bischoff, Ariel, another great friend of the gallery. As you said, it is a miracle to believe it ever happened. But it did, and here is someone who can tell you possibly more than any witness can about her father in particular, the ambiance. Helen Park Bigelow, who is now living on the peninsula, and who says she is thinking about, and I'm happy to report, writing about the art of the mid-century and her father and other painters. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Oh, there's no mic.
You just flip it on. Yeah. Flip it on. It's off. It's right here.
Okay. Okay, that's better. I also want to introduce my sister, Natalie Park Schutz, right here, and my cousin, Nancy Park. And so the family is well represented. I'm going to talk about my great aunt, Edith Truesdell. These are her paintings and a couple of others. This big one over here is hers. And I'm going to talk about Edith and my father, who is her nephew. And I would love to answer any questions when I'm through talking, so let any come into your mind as I go along. The first thing I want to say is I really wish you could hear Edith's voice. It was absolutely remarkable. It was think of Julia Child, or if you're old enough to remember, think of Eleanor Roosevelt. It was that kind of a chirpy, high energy, intense, vigorous, life-loving kind of voice. And my sister once said, when Edith laughed, it was a whoop. And that's exactly right. She was born in 1888, grew up in New England, was the youngest of a family of 6, and she had one older brother, all the rest were girls. And her nephew was born in Boston, the son of Edith's older brother and the oldest sibling in that generation. And when Edith was a child, she painted and drew all the time. And when she grew to be college age, she absolutely flatly refused to follow the footsteps of all of her older sisters and go to Wellesley. Instead, she announced to her parents that it was necessary for her to go to the study at the Boston Art Museum School, which she did. So she was very, very well trained, classically trained. And then as a young woman, she lived in California, but she went back east frequently to visit the family and to teach at the Boston Museum in the summer times. And so she got to watch her young nephew David grow up, and he was just the way she had been. All he wanted to do was paint and draw, and she was keenly interested in him and supportive of him from the time that he was a little kid on up. And he was supported by his family, the rest of his family. Edith was the only one who really understood and really deeply appreciated what was going on for this child and his intense involvement with drawing and painting. The other members, his parents and other members in the family, I think they kind of thought it was charming. They were very educated, very charismatic, very delightful, lively people, but they really basically wished that he would pursue something that would end up earning him a decent living so that he'd be able to support a family rather than be a painter. A common story. However, they supported him in that he always had drawing materials, he always had paints, and in a summer when he was high school age, my grandfather and David and his 2 brothers built a studio for him as a single freestanding cottage in the woods in New Hampshire where the family had a summer home, and that studio was so sturdily built that it still stands. And that's a lot of support to give a kid, to build a studio for them, even if you wish they'd go and be a lawyer, you know. So they sent him off to prep school, where all the people and all the kids in the family had always gone to prep schools. And David floundered and did terribly badly and was miserable, and failed to be passed from his sophomore year to his junior year. And so he repeated his sophomore year, and then he failed it again, and or was about to fail it again. And Edith went to visit him, and she was shocked by what she saw. He was a very intense, high energy person with bright eyes that looked straight at you, and very expressive face, very vigorous person in there. And what she saw was this languid, pale boy with flat eyes and no expression on his face at all. And she was immediately very worried, and she did what she always did when the two of them were together. She asked to see the paintings and drawings that he'd been doing lately, and she had stuff with her to show him, and they'd been doing that since he was very little. But he had next to nothing to show her, and she asked him why, and he said something to the effect that at the school they were allowed to paint or draw one Sunday afternoon a month from 2 to 4, and he consequently had almost no work. And he was clearly depressed, although that wasn't a word that was used in those days. Edith drove away and was very, very worried about him, and she went to see his parents in Boston, who were, as I said, her older brother and her sister-in-law. And we called them Granny and Grandpa. So she said to her older brother, she described David, she described everything that she'd noticed and found. And, she said, this just won't do. This will not do. And I don't think he should stay there. I think he's wasting away. I think it's a terrible place for him. I want to take him out of school. I want to take him with me back to California. And I want to put him in an art school there, because that's where he belongs. He's going to be a painter. That's what he needs, and that's why he's languishing. And my grandparents must have been really, really worried about David, or they never would have agreed with this. This was tantamount to saying, yes, you can drop out of high school, in a family where everybody had always gone to college. I mean, it was unthinkable what Edith proposed, and yet they gave their permission. And so off Edith and David went in her 29 Ford, drove across the country, and David must just have, he was 17, right? He was 17, and he must have felt absolutely, totally liberated. There he was driving across the country in this wonderful car, and with this woman who was so full of life, she was just bursting with it, and they were taking a break from driving and sitting out in the field and leaning against a tree and drawing. I mean, it just must have been a wonderful, wonderful trip. So they got to California. Edith lived in a little house up a canyon in back of Hollywood. She put him in the Otis Art Academy in LA. He spent a year there, and then with her blessing and undoubtedly with some money from her, he made his way up here to Berkeley, and he started auditing some classes at Cal and joined the art world. In no time at all, he was teaching a drawing class at a continuing education, lifelong learning kind of situation. He met people in the city. He met a sculptor named Gordon Newell, who had a younger sister named Lydia, who ended up being my mother. David fully entered the Bay Area art scene and totally flourished. In the meantime, Edith went on with her life down in LA, And whenever the two of them got together, they did what they'd been doing ever since he was a small child, which is talking about paintings and sharing their work and mulling over the changes in each other's work and in their own work, and doing that wonderful thing that like-minded people can do. And then, the years went by. David got sick and he died when he was 49. He died in 1960. And Edith outlived him by 27 years. She watched his reputation build, and she had great language for things when she would say things like, "Isn't it just swell?" Or it corking. She loved that. I once heard her say about my mother that Dee, she called her Deed was a corker. I remember that when I was very young. It made me feel so proud. My mother was a corker, and from this person, this Edith, who was so important in the family and in our lives. About David's reputation, she'd say, "Isn't that just corking? Isn't that swell? How perfectly splendid." She talked that way. Another way she talked, she called us all boys. It didn't matter whether we were male or female. We were boys. She'd say, "Come on, boys, it's time to go." And, I thought it was an Edithism. I thought that all my life. And recently I was reading F. Scott Fitzgerald. I was probably in The Great Gatsby, and there it was. And I realized it was a speech affectation of a time to call a group of people, male and female, boys, and Edith was doing it. But I didn't know that until just a couple of years ago. So Edith went on painting, and she showed. She worked hard to show. She exhibited. She won gold medals in juried exhibitions off and on over the years. She painted with complete involvement, engagement, intensity all her life. And the more David came into notice, the more interested some people were in Edith's work, and they were then comparing the two painters. And they were talking, it was commonly said and frequently written how strongly Edith Truesdell was influenced by David Park. And Edith was irritated by this because it was quite the other way around. She was his mentor, his friend, his ally, his best supporter all his life. And she influenced him profoundly. However, it is fascinating to look at the work of David Park and the work of Edith Truesdell, and I have tried to find my own way of understanding differences in their work. For one thing, Edith did a lot of landscapes, as you can see here, and David never painted landscapes. He had his abstract expressionist period, and then he had his figurative period. And in both, there were items, there were figures. It was not even the abstracts did not indicate a landscape at all. So I also, most of the paintings of Edith that we see are acrylics, and David's were all oils, except that he did a lot of gouaches, which is an opaque watercolor paint, at the end of his life. And we all know there's a difference in how an oil painting looks and how an acrylic looks. And I don't want to be judgmental about that, but there's just a difference. So I look at Edith's paintings, and it would be fun if we had a couple of great big oils of David's here on the wall too, but we don't. I think about the moment that Edith's paintbrush reaches out and connects with the canvas. And I can see her, and I can remember her and painting, and sometimes speaking just a little bit as she painted. And she would have her loaded brush in her hand, and there it would go to the canvas. And she was apt to say things like, well, maybe here, maybe this, yes, something like that. Her brush was exploring where it was supposed to go on that canvas. And I put that statement I just made over here, and over here I think of David painting, and I think of his loaded brush as he approaches the canvas, and it's very different. He approaches the canvas and he goes like that. He's not exploring. He skipped that step, or he graduated from that step, or it's very difficult to say this because I don't want to be sounding as if one way is better than another way. I'm just really trying to examine a difference because I'm interested in it. There is one more huge link of influence between the two of them, maybe or maybe not, or a similarity that I would like to talk about. When David found out that he had cancer, he was already terribly sick and in extreme pain, and he was told that he had from 4 to 6 months to live, and he lived 3. And as I said, he was 49. And right away he knew he was not ever going to be able to go upstairs to the studio again. He couldn't walk up the stairs. He couldn't do that much moving around to work in oils. He couldn't walk away from the canvas and back to it. He couldn't sit. He had to sort of lie. The pain was dictating what he could do, and what he could do was very minimal. However, he and his 2 best painter friends, Dick Diebenkorn and Elmer Bischoff, figured out how to rig up a platform to raise a chaise lounge high enough and anchor it firmly enough that David could get in and out of it, and have a hospital tray go across the front of it. And it could be placed in the living room where in the middle of the afternoon the light was really very good. And then we would get him out of bed and onto that chair in the living room, and he could paint. And he was in terrible pain, and he would often refuse to take any morphine until after he painted, because he didn't want to be dulled down from the morphine. So he painted that summer. We really don't know, because none of us were smart enough to catalog the work that he was doing. I think we were just too stunned by everything that was happening to think that way, which is really a big shame. But I think he probably did I'm just going to say maybe 150 gouaches in that summer. And that's a tremendous outpouring from somebody who is in hideous pain the whole time. Okay. Fast forward to Edith. She ends up living in a place called Carmel Valley Manor in Carmel Valley. It's a senior residence, and when she first moved there, she moved into a very nice, as I remember, a very nice and spacious apartment. I think maybe she even had a whole extra room that she used as a studio. She had a big patio. It was a full kitchen. It was really nice. But then as she got older and older, she moved to smaller accommodations that were closer to nursing stations and that sort of thing. And so the last many years that she was there, she lived in one bedroom. She had a closet, and she had a bedroom, and she had a bathroom. The bedroom had a single bed against one wall, and then the floor, a rug on the floor, and against the other wall there was this low bookcase and then a big window with a lovely view. And the room was not as wide as this room. And the closet, she had the door of the closet removed, and she had a big rug hanging over the closet entrance. It was not a Navajo rug, although she owned a lot of them. They've filtered down through the family now. It was some sort of an ethnic rug. It was very heavy. It was lined. The business end of it, the visual side of it, was sort of big blotches of cream and brown and dark red, and it was very handsome. And she would stand there and she would push this rug back and then station herself underneath it so that the rug, her body was holding the rug back. And she was tiny. She was not much over 5'2" or 3", and she never was overweight. She was a small, physically small person, and she would hold this huge rug back, and she would start hauling out of the closet, which had very few clothes in it, but it had these huge sheets of cardboard. Now, she loved her cardboard, and if you were driving someplace with her and you went past a store and she saw one of those pieces of cardboard that happened because of a washing machine having been delivered, that sort of thing, she would whoop and holler, and you had to stop and you had to go and ask, and you had to get that piece of cardboard in the car and get it back into her apartment. So she would haul out her pieces of cardboard and she would lay them all over the floor, and then she would haul out her blank canvas or her work in progress canvas and lay it down on top of the cardboard. Obviously the cardboard was to absorb any drips and any paint and keep them off the rug. And then she would pull a chair up and she would sit on the chair, and she had her paints nearby, and she would sit there and she would lean over and paint. And if the canvas was too large and she couldn't reach all of it from where she was sitting, she would stand up. She did a lot of painting standing up and leaning over the floor and leaning down and painting. However, by the time she got to be, I'd say in her early 80s to mid 80s, she, I think it became a little hard for her to paint on the floor, and so she moved the pieces of cardboard over to the top of her bed, and she stood there and she painted on top of her bed. And she painted until she was 96, and she died when she was 98. So the thing that I'm talking about here is the spirit in these two people. The spirit about work and the spirit about painting, and the refusal to even consider stopping just because you didn't have a studio or just because you were dying of cancer. They went on working because work was what they did. And it is a life-giving force and focus of theirs that certainly resonates deeply in my life today, and I hold up as a major value. And I love very much, and I think about all the time when I hear myself belly aching about not having enough room for, I'm a writer, so I have pages and chapters and papers all over the place, and I use the top of my bed all day, every day, and then as a work table, and then I have to put everything away at night, but then I think of Edith, or I think of David, and it's fine. I'm really lucky to have that bed for a work table. And we all know so many people who don't do what they want to do because they let something stop them. And David didn't let anything stop him, and Edith didn't let anything stop him. Well, what I'll never know is how much of David's action about all of that influenced Edith 27 years later as she approached, or 20 years later as she approached her very old age. I think David and Edith were each incredibly, totally, absolutely their own person. And however much David's drive to paint influenced Edith, I'll never know, but I have no doubt that even without the example of David and the way he always went on working, Edith would have done it too, because that's just who she was. She stopped finally when she, as I said, when she was 96. She had to stop. She was just too frail, couldn't do it anymore, and at the end was in a like a hospital unit. David stopped about 2 weeks before he died because the bone in his right arm shattered from a tumor, and then he couldn't hold a brush or move his arm anymore. So that's the dedication to work that we, my sister and I, my cousin, our whole family grew up with, that knowing and experiencing and observing that kind of focus and dedication to work. And it was a grand thing, and I'm really happy to be able to share it with you, and I would love to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Nancy.
Helen, tell me if my memory's right. I remember hearing that Edith, and I think I remember actually hearing from her, because I was in California by the early 60s, and so she was still living in Mill Valley, and I remember when she moved down to Carmel. And I remember that decades later, actually, she would resolve to stop painting.
She would what?
She would resolve to stop painting. She would say, she would decide.
I'm going to stop?
She would decide to stop painting.
I don't remember that. Do you, Nat?
No, you don't remember. Okay, it must be wrong. That's why we're here.
Yeah?
Helen, thanks for the wonderful recollection.
Oh, you're welcome.
Such a treat. Do you recall what period of time it was when she was living in the little apartment behind our house on Summer Street?
Pretty much. She came out after her husband died.
That's
She'd
right.
been living in Denver. And she came out to California because she had David.
Right.
And
It was
I was living on Buchanan at the time in Albany. And
the 50s.
that means
Yeah.
the 50s.
The early 50s,
Early
Jennifer.
Okay.
Yeah, I got married in 52, so it was after that.
Any idea of how long she was there? I don't think.
Not terribly long.
No, I think a couple of years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she came to get oriented, really, to
Okay.
this area, and then she was shopping for where she would go to live. She bought property on Mount Tamalpais and built a funky little house that notched into the hillside, and no rectangular rooms.
Or
it's fine.
permits.
Yeah, no permits. Right, and I'm sure it's long gone. But she enjoyed that until she decided she was always planning ahead, because she didn't have kids and she didn't want to be a burden. And we would have been the burden bearers, the nieces and nephews. She decided to go into a retirement home when she was, totally able and healthy and energetic.
And driving a little red MG.
No, but she had traded,
Oh, yeah.
she still had the MG, but she got that switched off to be a red VW convertible. Anyway, so she was down there ahead of her actual physical need, and was therefore there for 20 years. Yeah.
Anybody else? Yes?
I'm curious about your upbringing. I understand that your father was a Unitarian minister?
Our grandfather was.
Grandfather,
Yeah.
okay. Did that have any influence on the openness of the family and your your parents' desire to support him in his choice, do you think?
Probably, but not in any way that I could identify in terms of a specific memory. But my grandfather was intellectually really astute and a wise, kind person. And I think his Unitarianism was supported by his personality and supported his personality and certainly supported his children. However, he had the one daughter and 3 sons, and after he died, the daughter kept on being a member of that church and, you know, going to church and stuff like that for the rest of her life. I don't think my father or my uncle stepped foot in a church again for the rest of their lives after.
And they had been given permission. That is what they admired their father so for. He said, you make your mind up.
Yeah.
He did not impose it on him. He was very conscious of being a Boston minister and the straits that would place on the children, and he didn't want to do that to his kids. They admired him a lot.
Yeah.
There was a lot of mutual respect going
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
2 questions.
Yes.
One, what was it like emotionally to be the daughters of David Park?
Nat and I talk about this. This is the dominant question that has been asked to both of us all our lives. It's the most interesting and consequently and frustratingly the most difficult to respond to. I can remember before I started thinking about this question very deeply, long ago, I would say it wasn't like anything. It was just like as if he was a druggist or a dentist or anything else. He was just my father. Well, of course, that is the feeling a small child has, but then you start looking back and you start putting things together and understanding things. And I think that he gave us, not in instruction, but just through osmosis, he gave us a really deep appreciation of work, of painting, of music and the arts, of color. I remember a bush, it's all over Berkeley, it's all over the Bay Area. It's called the Princess Flower, and I can't remember the
Bright purple.
bright, beautiful, big, bright purple, iridescent bloom. There was one growing by the garage wall of the house up on Santa Barbara Road where we were living, and I was with him in the car one day when we came up the driveway and turned toward the garage, and the bush was there and the flowers were in full bloom, and his breath caught and he said, "Jesus Christ, that color." And that just went through me. I mean, I can get chills remembering it now. It was so important to hear that, and that was what he saw and what mattered to him and had just moved him through and through in that little second in the car. And so that was what it was like growing up having
But no, he didn't try to make us strong. And
No.
we weren't talented. And many years later, I did take a couple of adult art ed classes because I was no longer named Park and I didn't live in Berkeley and I could do it anonymously. And I found out that I could actually enjoy doing some art. I even went to San Jose State and took Art 1A and B. And then I knew that if I had wanted to, if I had been David, I could have done something or other and been proud of it. But I wasn't. I didn't have the push to do that. He had more push to paint than, anybody except Edith.
yeah, than anybody except Edith or his friends.
Yeah, but in our immediate
Yeah.
family.
Annalore?
But there were no, people used to expect us to be talented little girls who
Yeah.
have art.
That's what everybody said. Do you paint too? And we'd say, no. Oh gosh, what was I just going to say? Oh, I was reading about Milton Avery and something that his daughter said. He taught her how to paint, and they used to sit together and paint and draw. And I just could have wept when I read that. That just sounded, oh my God, I wanted to do that. I wanted that to have happened to us, but it didn't. Okay.
That was my question.
Yeah.
Did you ever sit together
No.
and ask him to show
No.
you? And
Never.
Never.
Never. If it was,
That's interesting.
if he was working, he was working. he was working, and that came first. And
And he
we,
never dared to ask why he didn't want to ask, to help him to help you draw something, to teach you something.
I think probably both. I never dared to. I never wanted to. I never thought to. Don't you
That's
think?
right,
I mean,
that's right.
it was
It was what he did.
it was what he did.
And sometimes where we lived in a lot of different places, but sometimes he would be painting right there in the living room. Like when we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it was a row house, so that front window was all the window there was. And he painted there, and then he would clean it up at night. But that little front edge of the living room was sort of off limits. We didn't go there. And it was always, you know, as I say, decent at night. But we were living our lives, going in and out of the living room all day long while he painted, but we weren't in it.
Never.
It was like an invisible wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it wasn't that we were excluded. We were not excluded. It was David's own power of personality and his absorption.
Yeah, somehow when you're faced with that kind of energy and focus, somebody's working that way, you don't interrupt them.
It's almost like an invisible wall
Yeah,
around.
yeah.
That's interesting.
Yes?
My second question.
Yes.
Was really interesting when you said that Edith liked to explore, and like I know as I paint that's the whole purpose of painting is to not know where it's going and imaginatively get there.
Yeah.
Where he didn't explore, it sounds like he was more goal-oriented. He knew what he wanted to do, or it sounds like right brain, left brain. I don't know if you'd call him more goal-oriented.
Not necessarily, but I think, he spent a lot of time. There he'd be in his studio, and the painting would be on the easel, and he would walk to the back of the studio, and he'd do that kind of thing, And he'd look at it this way and look at it this way and walk across the room, look at it from every angle. So he was thinking and seeing a lot and very deeply. And so I think by the time he got back up there and loaded up his paintbrush, I think that arm knew where it was going.
So he was exploring in a way.
It was very different. It was if you just think of the paintbrush meeting the canvas, it was really different. But I don't know how different the interior of the two people was. Yeah?
A lot has been written, obviously, about David's choice of subject matter in his painting.
Yeah.
My question is more on if you have had any conversations about Edith's choice of subject matter. Specifically, I've seen a lot of landscapes, but then there are these portraits, which I see few and far between, and I really like them. And it seems like, such a different subject matter. I mean, the painting style and everything, and colors are similar. Do you know any backstory on her choice of subject matter at any point in her career?
Not really, Jason, except, she was really classically trained. She had a lot of training, and I think that she was comfortable doing a lot of things. She did a portrait that still hangs in a school in Brookline, Mass. That's called the Park School, and it's a portrait of the sister of hers who started that school. And I've seen a black and white reproduction of that portrait, and it's beautiful and beautifully done, finely, expertly rendered painting. And she was
I've seen the
totally.
real one. Yeah.
You've seen the real one.
Yeah, and it's, she's wearing a laced collar of that era, and she has her dark hair up on a knot like those ladies. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
But her preferences between, inspirations between portraiture, landscape, and her abstractions, I don't really know what inspired her that day to go in one direction or another. Yeah.
She lived in the Southwest quite a lot. And I think a lot of the mountains and those kinds of colors come out of the Southwest, to my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. She was married to a man who was representing the Native Americans in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He was an advocate, and they slept out and camped out for weeks on end for years all over Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado and Utah. And she and I were talking about stars one time when she was very old and couldn't see stars anymore, and I started to carry on about what a terrible tragedy that was. Oh my God, you can't see the stars anymore. And she said, I've seen a lot of stars. And it makes me think of the years that she was out there and what that must have been like. Oh my gosh. Anybody else? Yeah.
One more time. What really struck me, or whatever, are the eyes
In that painting.
in that painting, and David's eyes. I think they are so much alike. That's, to me, they're just black balls, but they have so much expression.
They do. They do.
It's
And
so
that's,
interesting.
yeah. It's very striking, and that's something very, very true of the eyes in a head painted by my father. Just,
Yeah.
you look at it and it's just like with the paintbrush, and yet there's all of life in there. There's so much expression. It's amazing to me that can happen. And they both were really capable of that. Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you. Thank you for the question.